Chapter 19. Arrival and Awakening.
I told you he will wake up! He just needs time!
Abrian's voice rang around the stone room. G.A. slowly opened his eyes. His body was so heavy, it took an extraordinary amount of effort just to lift his eyelids.
Sir, he is still unawake. I think we need to assume the worst,
someone else said nearby. G.A. tried to raise his arm, but it felt like someone had tied a lead block to it. Straining his eyes, he could just see what looked like the top of an archway carved into a stone wall. Abrian's hair was visible but blurry. Raising his head was difficult, but G.A. managed to move just enough to recognise Abrian's face, angrily talking to a short, older lady with long, greying hair.
Joji?
Delilah's voice came from somewhere close to G.A.'s head. Moving his eyes to the furthest corner of his vision, he saw the top of Delilah's head next to him.
G.A.!
Suddenly her arms were around him, and she was sobbing into his chest. Abrian and the short lady noticed and hurried over.
Well, blow me down with a breath,
the lady said, folding her arms with a surprised look on her face.
You weren't joking when you said your friend was durable.
Delilah kept crying into G.A.'s chest, her breathing ragged and harsh.
I didn't think you'd wake up, Delilah hiccuped. Breathe, child. I don't want another patient on my hands, the lady said. Would you let up? She thought the love of her life had died,
Abrian retorted. The lady sighed and bustled out, muttering about furry-tailed foreigners.
G.A.!
cried a squeaky voice as Annie slung her arms around his head. Hono, Gina, Dominator and Morphea followed and stood around him. G.A. had never seen them look so relieved. Delilah's hair was strewn over his face, and G.A. realised he could feel it, so cool and soft. He took a breath, feeling the air filling up his lungs. Then he took another and another. There was a warm, thumping feeling inside his chest. Delilah leant her forehead against his, and he shut his eyes as his tears fell onto his shaking smile. Hello, Mogra. Abrian sat back against the wall as the others crowded around G.A. Hono sat beside him, shaking his head in disbelief.
Aluiciuses. They're far too strange.
Annie and Dominator were enraptured with G.A.'s feet. He couldn't feel his toes yet, or indeed even wiggle them. Don't you dare, warned Morphea, before they started experimenting to see how much he could feel. You don't break the toes of someone who single-handedly stopped the rain. What? Said G.A., blinking as Morphea swam into focus, standing at the end of what he realised was his bed. You disappeared into the sea with the potion poison... Oh, for goodness sake, the magic potion! And then the water sort of expanded, then exploded. It destroyed the ship, threw us all overboard. We knew you must have done something. The ship was destroyed.
Blasted to smithereens,
nodded Abrian.
We had to stay afloat on the wreckage for I don't know how long. I remember feeling so tired, and poor little Pippa was getting dangerously cold. The rest of us were cold too, Abrian,
remarked Hono.
Pippa is more loved than any of us, and we know it,
said Abrian, scratching the dragon under her chin as she rested on top of Gina's head. Anyway, Dominator cut in loudly. Eventually, one morning we saw these strange shapes on the horizon. Turned out they were ships, 3 of them, and they'd come looking for us.
Turns out those snowmen really did want those dresses back. They'd been on our trail ever since, said Abrian. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have been rescued so easily, since they're so strong. They were in the first ship. The second was from Maemia's island, and the third
belonged to me.
A woman was standing in the doorway, dressed in deep magenta embroidered in gold. A circlet of stars made of what looked like crystal was strung about her head, entwined in her long auburn hair.
There remains a most significant meeting that has long been delayed. I sent my ship to find His Highness Prince Tepid when he failed to meet my emissaries in Nausea. It appears he has had quite the adventure.
She looked at them all, and her eyes twinkled.
I am very pleased to see the missing member of your party has finally awoken.
As are we, Your Majesty, said Morphea, ducking her head in a bow and elbowing Dominator to do the same. Thank you again for staying your ship to find him.
I believe your gratitude is slightly misplaced. After all, it was your Norsian sailors who proved such useful navigators.
Bligh and Seaward? Said G.A. amazed.
And Masters Haidur and Morland,
said the woman.
My ship came across them traversing the topmost seas. When we explained the reason for our journey, they became our guides. It was most fortunate for all of you that they did. They insisted on searching for your companion when it became clear he had not surfaced. We remained at sea for a day and a night before he was found adrift, while the Snowmen cared for the rest of you on their own ship. Your Norsian comrades will be very pleased to know you have made it through. Which reminds me.
She drew a small package from within her sleeve.
Before they returned to their city, they left you this. I believe it may be a gesture of reconciliation.
Jay couldn't take the package, so Annie carefully unwrapped it for him. Inside was a peculiar-shaped object that rolled onto the bed. "It's a fruit!" she said, reeling back in disgust.
"Oh! It must be that one and only fruit that grew on Morland's fruit tree,"
said Honno.
"I think your death-defying escapade made an impression on them, G.A. It's even got a ribbon tied on it."
G.A. stared at the fruit. It was yellow, waxy and oval-shaped. He didn't quite know what to do with it. He'd never been given a gift of food before.
"Well, I will take my leave,"
said the woman, smiling at their fascination with the fruit.
"I must attend to other matters. Please consider yourselves my guests here throughout your recovery. And to you,"
she looked directly at G.A.,
"I bid you the warmest welcome to the Glass Mountains."
Her footsteps padded away down what must have been a very long stone passage. The Glass Mountains. They had been brought back to their own land. Well, not quite, but it was close enough. G.A. had so many questions, but he found he was drowsy again. They could wait. "How come we didn't get a present? We nearly died too," mumbled Dominator, as everyone left G.A. and Delilah in peace and headed out of the room into the passage.
"Not as much as G.A.,
reasoned Honno. "Actually, there is a note addressed to the anti-tepid revolution," said Annie, pulling a piece of parchment out of the wrapping still clutched in her hand. Standing under a lamp, Abram unfolded it as the others peered over his shoulder. Written inside was a single line. "You're still in range." The land of the Glass Mountains was like nothing any of them had encountered on their travels. After their rescue and the Snowmen had returned to Snoema, the ATR were brought in wide, shallow boats steered by long poles up a canal system that climbed from the sea through the mountains. At their heart, rough rock gave way to stone masonry. Buildings carved out of the rock combined with timber-framed structures with a proud, gated citadel in the centre. Everywhere rang with the sound of wind chimes, and nearly all the people appeared to have auburn hair. None of the Felnotians noticed this much at first. After their rescue, they were all weak from exhaustion, but after several days they each began to mend. Delilah had barely left G.A.'s side while she waited anxiously for him to wake up. When she did give in to sleep, her vigil was taken over by E.A., who sat for long hours beside his brother's bed, staring into nothingness. He was asleep when G.A. finally surfaced and missed the happy reunion with the others. As soon as he heard the news his brother was awake, he ran the length of the long, low halls that filled the mountain palace they were housed in. He almost missed the door and hit the wrong room, but he finally skidded to a halt in time to see his brother grinning sheepishly at him. All E.A. could do, through all the tiredness, confusion and emotions built up over so many long weeks, was lean on the doorframe.
"Should have known you'd find a way somehow,"
he said. G.A. would have shrugged if he could. He desperately wanted to tell his brother that he didn't feel any resentment towards him for telling him about his ghostly fate. If E.A. hadn't, G.A. might have carried on unawares, continuing to forget what it meant to be alive. He hoped his smile would say enough for now, and he got the feeling E.A. understood. There was a long pause.
"You know, this won't do,"
said E.A. at last, and for a fleeting moment G.A. felt worried.
"Now you're solid and alive, we're almost identical again.
G.A. grinned, embarrassed but pleased. "I'm still the better-looking twin," he replied. They were interrupted by a knock at the door, and a small physician walked in. He had been observing G.A. since he arrived, under strict orders from the Queen. He sat next to G.A. in his bed and picked up his arm to examine his fingers. G.A. watched curiously.
"So, how long do you think he'll be like this?"
E.A. asked.
"Well, his body has gone through a process called recalcification. First case I've ever seen,"
the physician replied.
"You see, I think ghosts aren't able to form bones on their own. There has to be something to make it happen. In this case, an extreme surge of magic did it, I suppose. I'm not sure why you thought going down there in the state you were in was a good idea."
He glanced at G.A. "Oh, well, you see," G.A. started.
"It reminds me of a good friend. I don't know why she thought it was a good idea, but she decided to go climbing with a broken wrist. As you can imagine, it's rather difficult to go climbing with a broken wrist, even with magic as strong as hers. She's really quite good, you know, strongest user of magic on the mountain. Or at least she was until she went climbing and fell. Now both wrists are..."
The physician stopped mid-sentence when he noticed E.A.'s confused and concerned face.
What was I talking about?"
the physician added.
"How long will the recalcification take?"
E.A. asked cautiously, not wanting the physician to talk for much longer.
"Oh, I don't know,"
the physician replied chirpily.
"I've never treated a ghost who has been brought back to life before. You'll need somebody with far more imagination."
If G.A. was capable of groaning, or better still disappearing, he would have done so gladly. "Hey, G.A., is Annie in?" Dominator said, popping his head around the door before seeing the physician. "Nope, nobody nope," he blurted and retreated quickly.
"Nice chap, isn't he?"
the physician twittered. E.A. was horrified someone could outtalk Dominator to the point he would actively avoid them. G.A. was more concerned about how much his blood hurt. Tepid stood beside an open window, looking out across the clouded vista beneath it. A tiny vase stood on the sill, filled with glass flowers. They clinked gently as a chilly breeze brushed past their petals. He shut his eyes as footsteps approached and held his breath for a moment. The woman dressed in magenta stopped, and he turned to face her. She bowed her head, and he did likewise.
"So, you've arrived at last, Your Highness,"
she said as she looked up at him.
"It would appear so, Your Majesty,"
Tepid replied.
"Peony, please. I would like to be addressed by my name in my kingdom,"
said the woman. Tepid bowed again.
"Apologies, my Queen Peony."
She smiled briefly, though her eyes remained grave.
"This time had to come. It could not be avoided any longer. I had hoped you would understand."
Tepid held her gaze, steeling himself.
"Yes, I suppose it could not."
The woman dipped her eyes low for a moment.
"How long has it been now, since she died?"
4 years, plus the first half of the 5th,
said Tepid, quietly.
"Only 4.
Peony raised her eyes to Tepid. They were piercingly blue and unblinking. Tepid stayed perfectly still. The flower petals chimed gently in the breeze.
"You'd walk these corridors and laugh together, you and my daughter,"
said Peony at last, her eyes flitting up and down the passage.
"Do you remember how she looked at you?"
"She could make you feel like everything you did brought her happiness,"
said Tepid after a moment.
"As if you were so special, so important to her. And her smile was so warm."
He stopped, his brow furrowed. Peony watched him closely.
"She was so clever, so good at making people help her,"
she said.
"Her name. Do you remember her name?"
"Roisin, after the flowers that grew in the courtyard,"
Tepid murmured. He looked pained.
"That's what it was. But she's dead,"
he said abruptly.
"The name Roisin died with her."
Hidden in his sleeve, his fist tightened as he fought for courage.
"And I believe that is for the best,"
he added. Peony's blue eyes shone for a moment. Then she let her shoulders relax as she took a deep breath.
"You've come a very long way. I'm very pleased."
Her slender hands rested on the windowsill as Peony looked across the landscape below, and her fingertips gripped the edge as she spoke.
"Though she bore our name, the Witch of the Glass Mountains cut herself off from her people when she began to destroy yours. She shaved her hair as an act of severance, the last good deed she ever did. But we still felt such shame that one of our own would commit the atrocities she did. When she died, I had us withdraw from all society. I confess, I was afraid. Afraid of what the world must think of us."
She drew another steadying breath of cold air.
"Yet, I think this has gone on for long enough. The legacy of her reign must end. The Glass Mountains want peace."
The wooden floor creaked as Tepid took a step forward. He had never felt so relieved in all his life, though he did his best to maintain his princely aura.
"I can assure you, my Queen Peony, Nausea would like nothing but the same."
At last, Peony's smile reached her eyes, and the stars in her crown glittered as a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds outside.
"I must say, I am so glad to see you again,"
she said.
"I too, Your Majesty,"
replied Tepid, finally able to smile himself.
"You've grown taller as well,"
remarked the Queen, a playful glint in her eye.
"Not at all,"
said the Prince.
"Just more fond of good shoes."
Peony laughed as they turned away from the window, Tepid casually batting away a bee buzzing about his head.
"What is that?"
asked Peony curiously.
"To all intents and purposes, it is a honeybee,"
he said, flicking his hair protectively.
"Strange to see one at this altitude."
"Most peculiar."
But then Peony stopped. Someone was running down the passage towards them. In a split second, a figure flashed past. Tepid caught a glimpse of a bandaged Failed Notion tail as EA fled down the corridor, skidded on the corner, and almost fell.
"Failed Notions do run around quite a lot,"
remarked Tepid, looking a little confused.
"Must be something to do with being cooped up on a ship for so long. Although I do believe that passage leads to a balcony,"
he called after the rapidly retreating figure.
"You're reaching a dead end, my good fellow."
EA screeched to a halt, looking horrified. Before Tepid or Peony could comment further, another set of footsteps pattered towards them. A second person emerged at the entrance to the passage. They were dressed in foreign clothes, had fine silver hair, and wore a very nervous expression. "Oh!" They stopped short at the sight of the two rulers and quickly bowed. "Your Majesties, I'm terribly sorry for intruding upon your significant meeting. My ship has just arrived from the Aral Isle. We are here with the permission of the Lady Maemia."
"What a strange but welcome surprise,"
said Peony.
"I was informed the ship belonging to the Lady Maemia had returned to its island. Surely you haven't come to deliver more Failed Notions plucked from the sea?"
"Forgive me, Your Majesty," panted the Aral Islander, "but we were never sent to retrieve the Failed Notions. What we were searching for couldn't be found in the wreckage. When we returned to our home empty-handed, He trembled. "We were sent directly to you. Please know we intended to come as peacefully and calmly as possible," he added loudly, glancing over his shoulder with wide eyes. "But she insisted on travelling with us, and now the situation is out of our control."
"She?"
repeated Peony.
"The Lady Maemia?"
The Aral Islander shook their head miserably as a shadow appeared behind him. With a swirl of flowing robes, it filled the entrance to the passage. The whole space darkened as if deep clouds had bloomed over the sky. A pair of golden eyes, glinting with fury, shone from the gloom as the Archivist stepped forwards.
"Madam Archivist,"
said Tepid politely,
"how can we be of assistance?"
"I have not come to speak to you," I have come to retrieve an overdue book,
said the Archivist, glowering down the passage at EA. Please, my lady, pleaded the Aral Islander. We're in civil company.
Where is the book?
Demanded the Archivist, sweeping down the passage. EA backed away, all the fur on his tail standing on end.
Return it to me this instant.
Oh dear, this seems to be a pickle,
said Tepid as the Archivist bore down upon EA.
Could you elaborate, EA? I borrowed a book without asking,
said EA tremulously, shrinking against the wall as the Archivist seemed to grow several inches.
To help my twin brother.
Thievery,
the Archivist snarled. The shadows intensified.
I was going to return it when we got home.
The Archivist's eyes flared and her eyebrows seemed to sharpen into thin points like needles. A low sound like the buzzing of an angry swarm of bees filled the passage.
I had to take it,
cried EA over the noise.
It was my only chance to help GA. I'm very sorry I stole it, but there was no other way of getting a book out of the archive.
Because it was mine,
hissed the Archivist. Her height increased again. Her neat hair was coming loose, while her dusty robe swished in an invisible wind.
What use is a book if no one can read it?
Shouted EA, terror slipping into anger.
What's the point of protecting books if no one can use what's written in them?
The Archivist's golden eyes narrowed dangerously. EA was breathing heavily, but forced himself to look back at her.
I'm very sorry I stole that book, and I'm willing to take whatever punishment I have to. I regret the stealing, but I don't regret taking that book out of your archive and using it for the reason it was written.
And where is the book now?
Said the Archivist slowly.
At the bottom of the sea. It sank with the rest of our ship.
EA's words tailed off as he shrank back against the wall again. It looked as if the Archivist was about to unravel. Sparks flew from her eyebrows, and the light in her eyes flared as her fury swelled like a thunderstorm ready to burst. EA shut his eyes against whatever was going to happen as she grew, filling the passage with darkness and power.
Necrominicetomy and Mortality by Morai MFX?
Asked a cheerful voice through the storm. EA opened an eye. Tepid had slipped in beside him, looking up at the Archivist as if inquiring about the weather.
A heavy blue volume, wasn't it?
He observed. The Archivist didn't seem to be paying attention, but Tepid continued.
It's interesting. You see, I'm very familiar with the library back at Nausea. Being an only child, I had to divert myself with my own company. Apologies, EA, if you don't understand,
he added. He gave EA a pat on the shoulder.
I seem to recall leafing through that particular book, and very dull reading it was too. All the same,
the Prince went on,
I do distinctly remember that book being given as a loan to the Aral Islands. Curiously, it was never returned. Perhaps you could enlighten us, Madam Archivist. It must be thoroughly overdue by now, wouldn't you say?
The Archivist's eyes, darting between EA and the Prince, were suddenly fixed on Tepid. She didn't say a word, but looked like the air was leaking out of her, her height decreasing slowly.
Well now,
said Tepid with a flick of his hair.
Seeing as this book did indeed belong to Nausea after all, it seems fitting that the punishment for its theft and destruction should be decided by Nausea. Don't you agree?
Still the Archivist said nothing, but continued to gradually return to her normal height. Queen Peony watched them calmly while the Aral Islander peeped nervously from behind her. The Archivist stood still, her eyes lingering hungrily on EA.
I think that would be best,
said Tepid, stepping a little more in between them. The buzzing sound had grown quieter, and the passage was lighter. At last the Archivist stepped away, gliding slowly back to the entrance.
So be it,
she said venomously. Before they could say another word, she had disappeared, her eyes gleaming one last time as they caught the sunlight. The Aral Islander, looking as if they couldn't believe their luck, hastily bowed and jogged after her.
What was that all about?
Hono, Dominator and Morphea were peeking around the opening to the passage curiously, clearly wondering how a storm cloud could have swept through an indoor corridor.
Library matters,
said Peony.
Nothing particularly interesting.
Come on, EA. We've heard there's food happening soon,
said Hono, suddenly noticing EA behind the two rulers.
Ah, I do believe Master Aluiciuous will be joining you presently,
said Tepid carefully.
There are some details I must discuss with him first, if you please.
Hono and Morphea looked perplexed, while Dominator shrugged. Well, don't be too long, he called, as he and the others headed for the main hall. Queen Peony made to follow them, pausing at the entrance to the passage.
I will await your company at dinner,
she said, dipping her head gracefully before departing, and left Tepid and EA alone together.
Thank you,
said EA weakly, when her steps were no longer audible.
You Aluiciuses do seem to have a peculiar hobby of near-death experiences, don't you?
said Tepid, rubbing the bridge of his nose.
It's never knowingly intentional,
said EA. Tepid chuckled a little.
Unfortunately, the Archivist is quite correct in her claims, as are you in your justifications. However, what you did knowingly.
He sighed and put his hands behind his back.
I have said before I cannot condone thievery. Do you understand?
Yes.
EA nodded steadily. Once upon a time he might have run away or fought his way out, but this time he didn't. He stayed still beside the window as the cold air drifted through the passage. Tepid twitched a smile.
How we've both come on, eh?
He said thoughtfully. The wind had left the high windows and the petals of the glass flowers fell silent again. In honour of her guests, and possibly to show off the grandeur of her palace and her hospitality, Queen Peony had a banquet organised the night before Prince Tepid left for Nausea and the ATR headed home, back to Feldnor at last. The banquet hall was magnificent. From the pearly ceiling hung round glass ornaments, coloured by the evening sunlight, making the room seem to glow. High windows in the entrance hall beyond the open doors filled the space with rich shades of pink and gold. GA couldn't join his friends that evening, but requested detailed reports about everything they had to eat, as food was becoming of great interest for him. Delilah had elected to stay with him in solidarity. She didn't care that much for pomp and royalty anyway. Besides, GA had mentioned he needed to talk with her about something, though she had no idea what. When she asked him about it, he eventually said he couldn't quite remember at that moment. Seated around a table in new clothes provided by the mountain people, Hono, Abrian, Morphea, Gina, Annie and Dominator were intrigued by all the finery around them. Courtiers, nobles and other more obscure varieties of important people, all with auburn hair and glittering raiment, murmured pleasantly to each other. A lot of them were too shy to speak to the Feld notions, but they had all heard the strange stories about the sea, the rain and a ghost. The ATR couldn't help feeling a little pleased as they stared at the wonderful glassworks around them. Some time to decompress was sorely needed for all of them. It was so nice to be feeling well, to be in this beautiful place, and better still, to have the promise of home in the morning. All of them, that is, except for Annie. She was becoming uncharacteristically quiet the longer they stayed in the mountains. That evening, all the light and chatter was making her head spin. Annie wasn't used to the heaviness of the incense and the smells of the unfamiliar, fragrant plants around her. What she was used to, though, was food. On all the tables were plates piled high with exquisite foods. It all smelt so good. Annie was sure her stomach would try and climb out of her to eat them. Maybe it was a good thing she was struggling to breathe a little, as the blocked passageways kept her stomach from escaping. Coughing a little, she felt a warm hand on her shoulder.
Struggling, dear?
Annie coughed again and nodded at the grey-clothed figure next to her. The woman looked like one of Queen Peony's ladies-in-waiting, who were dotted around the hall.
May I aid you? My grandson struggles with the strong smells too.
Yes, please, Annie croaked at the nice lady. Smiling gently, the lady in grey put a hand on Annie's head and let her warm, purple magic flow into Annie. It was gentle and calming. Annie soon felt her lungs open again, and the tight sensation in her throat left her. Thank you. That really helped, Annie said, smiling at the lady. Her stomach growled as if to thank her too. Remembering how hungry she was, Annie found herself filling her mouth with the food. It tasted so much nicer than anything she'd eaten on the ship. The grey lady smiled. Annie caught her eye and paused. Should I be waiting? She asked, her cheeks bulging.
Well, the rest of us usually wait for Her Majesty before we begin eating, but you're an honoured guest, so I'm sure you'll be all right.
Just like her magic, the lady's voice was gentle and warm, making Annie feel safe. She didn't feel unsafe before. She was with Dominator and her friends after all. But something about this lady helped her feel more at ease. Swinging her legs happily, Annie suddenly noticed a pair of handmaidens by one of the doors. They were both in long, dark grey dresses and had their hair pinned up and pulled back from their faces. What really caught Annie's attention, though, were their smirks and stares. She wasn't used to being stared at like that. Annie began to fidget. Maybe she had snot on her face or her pigtails were wonky. But looking in the mirror-like plates in front of her, she could see that wasn't the case. Was it something else wrong with her? Looking back at the maidens, she could see them talking to each other, but could only make a few words out. Fat.
Eats so much.
Doesn't care how she looks.
So fat. Heart attack.
Annie felt something warm on her hands. She realised she was scratching the back of her left hand and had started drawing blood. She didn't even know why she was doing it. The lady in grey held her wrist and purple magic flowed onto Annie's wounds, healing them. Annie blinked away hot tears.
Don't worry, my dear,
the lady said.
I'll look after you.
Annie's head felt fuzzy, as if her comment reminded her of something she had forgotten a long time ago.
All rise for the Queen,
someone said loudly. Annie couldn't see the person speaking, so she assumed their voice came from somewhere in the open space above them. As she strode in, Annie could get a better look at Queen Peony in her full royal splendour. She was tall and slender, and seemed to embody everything the Glass Mountain stood for, namely purity and grace. Her flowing robes and ornate headpiece, although drawing inspiration from aspects of the local dress, were clearly a cut above. The decorations on her gleamed in the lights, giving her an ethereal look. As soon as the Queen sat down, the doors where the handmaidens stood flew open, and a flurry of servants and attendants appeared. They carried glass pitchers of fermented drinks and fizzy pink liquids. The grey lady waved one over and poured a glass of fermented drink for Annie. The attendee looked a little sceptical, but the lady ignored them.
Here, this will warm you and calm you down,
she said to Annie. The purple-green coloured liquid swirled in the ornate glass. Annie found herself more interested in staring at it than drinking it.
Nope,
Adrian said loudly, before snatching the glass out of Annie's hands and handing her a fizzy drink instead.
That was rather rude,
the lady said lightly, glaring at Adrian, who sat across from Annie. He had been trying to convince Pippa eating fish bones in polite company was not correct behaviour when he spotted the drink in her hand.
Yes, but I have to look after Annie after dinner, and she's bad enough if you give her cake. I don't need her to get drunk on magic either,
Adrian said, as he held Pippa firmly so she didn't fly off to find the kitchens.
While you make a fair point, you could still be...
It's all right, Annie said to the lady. He's just looking out for me, and I don't want to cause him any more trouble. The lady could tell something still bothered Annie. She shot a glare at the handmaidens on her behalf, who suddenly found the ceiling extremely interesting. Sipping her drink, Annie suddenly noticed that everyone else had started eating. Or so she thought until she looked carefully at one of the mountain people. Their eyes were closed and magic flowed from them to the food. The longer Annie watched, the less colour was in the food. Picking up her knife and fork, Annie began to cut her food into very small pieces and ate tiny amounts at a time.
Is everything all right, child?
The lady asked. I was wondering, Annie began. How are they doing that? The lady followed Annie's gaze and made a noise of understanding.
It's a special magic we use here. It allows us to absorb the pure essence of the food without having to actually eat it.
Why do they do that?
Well, it allows us to stay pure and avoid putting anything unnecessary into our bodies, like fat, to keep us healthy.
Annie stared at the plate in front of her. Can I learn to do it? She asked brightly. The lady blinked in surprise and stared back at her.
Why would you need to, dear?
Because I don't want to be fat, Annie said. Aguiar and Dominator's heads nearly flew off their necks as they quickly turned to face her. They'd never heard Annie talk like this before.
Why do you think that?
Aguiar said, clearly struggling to keep his voice even. It's that... Annie found it difficult to get the words out of her mouth.
Is it because of what those two were saying just now?
The lady asked gently, indicating the handmaidens as she placed a hand on Annie's. Annie silently nodded. Dominator's hand shook as he struggled to keep his magic from spilling out.
Oh, my dear, they're just being petty and horrible. You're beautiful, and even if you were a larger size, that wouldn't change. You don't need to deprive yourself of anything just because someone else thinks you should.
Dominator managed to catch the lady's attention and mouthed, "Who?" at her.
I promise you, dear,
the lady said to Annie while holding eye contact with Dominator.
Those women standing by the door are telling lies and being malicious for no reason. Let's just enjoy the food.
Dominator pushed himself out of his seat and marched over to the door. Aguiar followed him while Pippa took the opportunity to steal tidbits from his plate. Thank you, Isoletto, Annie said, wiping her eyes, unaware that Dominator and Aguiar were now confronting the handmaidens, or that she had just said the lady's name.
How did you...
You did what to our guest?
The Queen's voice ran out over the feast. Annie quickly turned in time to see the handmaidens kneeling before Queen Peony, begging for forgiveness.
I'm not the one you've offended,
the Queen hissed. By now she had the attention of everyone in the room. Annie shifted in her seat uncomfortably. I'm not hungry anymore, she mumbled as she jumped out of her seat and ran from the room. Annie knew she was somewhere in the citadel, but her rumbling stomach and fuzzy head made it hard for her to say exactly where. Sitting on the floor against a wall, Annie pulled her knees into her chest. She'd felt miserable most of the time she'd been in the mountains, but she didn't know why. Physically, she felt strange too, but had assumed that was exhaustion from the adventure.
I say, where are you going?
Was that Tepid she could hear? She hadn't heard him speak like that before. Looking around, she couldn't see him, but one of the doors down the corridor was slightly open.
Away from you and your silly counsellors,
a female voice said sharply. The voices echoed like whispers in the wind, and he didn't like listening in on shouting conversations, but she didn't have much of a choice with how she was feeling right now.
I'm sorry, I know they can be a bit much. It's not them that's the problem. Then what is? I'm trying to understand, really I am. Get this into your head. I don't want you around those other women. What? Especially that psychopath for hire. So I'm not allowed to see my friends? No, you are. Just not her. You're being unreasonable. And you're a fop who can't keep to one woman. I thought you said you were serious about me. Raheen, I am. Then don't associate with them. Ever. Be reasonable. I am. No, you...
There you are, Annie,
Tepid said, smiling. Suddenly he was there, his usual relaxed, princely self. Annie glanced at the door through which she thought she'd heard him arguing with someone. What? How? Annie started.
You don't exactly blend into the stonework, so it wasn't too hard to spot you.
He joked kindly. He half slid down the wall, somewhat awkwardly, until he sat next to her. No, that's not... Annie was confused. Weren't you just talking to someone called Roisin?
I have been in the banquet hall, not the corridors,
said Tepid quizzically.
You didn't say Roisin, did you?
It might have been. One of them sounded just like you. Annie blinked. Maybe it was someone else having an argument then.
She's here!
Abrian's voice rang out as he, Dominator and Queen Peony made their way towards them, followed by two very humble handmaidens. Annie, are you all right? Dominator cried, almost skidding into her in his haste.
She's clearly not after that incident,
Abrian said, glaring at the handmaidens who peeped sheepishly from behind the Queen. No, Abrian,
Maybe you should listen to Annie about how Annie feels,
Tepid said, tapping his finger on his folded arms. He was beginning to feel quite bemused at the number of emotional failed notions he'd dealt with that day. Dominator and Abrian turned to look at Annie. Dominator's magic, which had been sparking, started to pool at his fingertips before it dripped to the floor. Annie stood up and took him by the hands. Dommy, I'm all right. I'm not exactly happy, but I'm not upset anymore. I'm mostly hungry, actually.
Well, that's unsurprising. You left most of your meal,
Queen Peony interjected. Turning her attention to the two handmaidens, Annie let go of Dominator's hands and stood in front of them. Dominator wanted to grab hold of her and drag her away from these nasty women, but decided against it. He realised how Annie was trying to be more mature about this. I know you said horrible things about me, Annie said to them. But I also know you're probably only here because your queen made you come. Her words shocked Abrian, Dominator, and the handmaidens. One began looking at the other. She's right, though. I don't know about you, Clara, but I'm not actually sorry.
Ira, please, we need...
Clara stopped herself when she saw Abrian's face and Dominator's magic flickering again. It's all right. I forgive you, Annie said bluntly. Iro and Clara could only stare at Annie now. You think I'm a lower life form, right? That you can say whatever you want because I'm somehow worse than you.
No, we...
Iro stopped. Something in Annie suddenly looked darker and a lot more frightening. Even Abrian was becoming concerned. Don't deny it. That's the only reason someone in your position would dare to be so cruel, Annie said, smiling. Her eyes suddenly flashed with a pink light.
I think that's quite enough,
Abrian said, placing a hand on Annie's shoulder. Tepid stayed silent. Something in her words reminded him far too much of someone else.
Let's get some food in you. You'll feel better then.
Abrian gave Annie a little tug. Slowly she turned and walked with him back to the banqueting hall.
You two are dismissed. We'll talk later,
Queen Peony said to Iro and Clara. The two handmaidens practically sprinted down the hall away from the group.
Why don't you go and get some refreshment too, young prince?
Tepid said, recovering himself and standing up again. Looking annoyed and confused, Dominator wandered off after his friends.
They certainly are a lively bunch, your failed notion friends,
Queen Peony said.
You haven't seen the half of it,
Tepid half chuckled.
I think we should also return to the banqueting hall. You all have a lot of preparations to make for your journey home,
the Queen suggested.
Of course, I would happily have you stay longer. I don't doubt you have many wonderful tales to tell of islands and deserts and oceans.
Indeed, if only I could,
said Tepid.
However, I really must relieve poor Oswald of his post.
He smiled, seeing visions of his loyal steward finally cracking under the strain caused by his sovereign's much extended absence.
Ah, yes. My emissaries reported he seemed rather frayed at the edges.
Peony giggled.
Aha, that sounds like him,
said Tepid, strolling down the corridor with Peony beside him.
I do believe he will be in need of a holiday. After all my travels, I could certainly recommend some lovely locations. In the wake of today's meeting, the Owl Isle does rather spring to mind.